All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Knapp, and I'm so excited to have you all back here for Mappy Hour 2021. We are kicking off this season, of course, talking about winter hiking and staying safe out in the backcountry or wherever you are playing in the snow. And I'm so excited tonight to have Jana from Adventure Untamed. Before I pop out and let her take over, I just want to let everyone know there is a comment section, obviously, at the bottom here, and I will be in there moderating. So please just be kind to one another and say hello, introduce yourselves, say where you're from, what you're most excited for this winter, and we'll have some fun in there. And with that, I'm so excited to have Jana share with us hiking all 4 seasons.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jana, and I'm the founder and owner of Adventure Untamed. We are an outdoor guiding company based out of New York City, and we do hiking and other outdoor adventure trips all year long. Um, and just to tell you a little bit about myself, hiking in the winter and just all outdoor activities in the winter are my absolute favorite. Winter is my favorite time of year, and I think there is just a special. Um, I think there's a special sort of a challenge to it, and um, you get to see places in a completely different way. You get to go and break trail in fresh snow where it feels like you're the first people to be there. And in a sense, you are because you're literally breaking trail on this kind of new territory that's formed in the winter. And to tell you a little bit about some of the climbs that I've done that might be relevant to today, my most technical climb has been the Matterhorn. It was not, however, the coldest. My coldest ascent was out in the Adirondacks, and that was on Mount Marcy, and we were finishing in about negative 30 degrees. And my worst conditions was on Mount Washington, which is kind of interesting because it's a considerably smaller mountain compared to a lot of places in the country, never mind the world. But that was the ascent where we had these really extreme conditions where you literally couldn't see 10 feet ahead of where you were going or behind you. Um, so I really wanted to talk to you about winter hiking because I find that a lot of people are intimidated by it if they haven't done it. There is almost a sentiment that if winter is coming, it's time to do something different, whether it be skiing or something very winter specific or just staying at home. And my goal is to really change that because, like I said, I think that hiking in the winter is some of the most interesting time to hike and some of the most rewarding. So today I'm going to talk to you about 5 different topics, basically all that are important to winter hiking and hiking safely. So I'm going to talk about general safety, then temperature regulation, nutrition and hydration, do and rotate and lead on the trail, and then we're going to talk about traction. And afterwards, I'm also going to leave time for questions. It's a huge topic, and I would like to introduce you to all the different aspects. But if you have any specific questions, please always feel free to reach out to me either through questions or by contacting me, whatever is easiest for you. So let's start with general safety. And another thing I just want to say before I start is some of you may be more familiar with some of these concepts than others, and something might sound familiar and something might be new. So just some of it will be an overview, and then for some of it will go into specifics. So as far as general safety, um, this might be a good idea year round, but specifically in the winter, we generally recommend that you hike with at least one other person. And the reason we say that is because winter really changes everything. And something that might just be a simple mistake in the summer can turn really seriously very fast in the winter. Just to give you an example that we've experienced on trail, we once had a client with us who was a very, very experienced hiker. And I'm talking about somebody that has hiked some of the seven summits, so really, really experienced hiker. And she was doing a trail at her own pace, up in the Catskills. So, very low mountains compared to, again, places around the world. And it was a very straightforward trail in that it was all one color. It wasn't, there weren't any forks going off, but accidentally, as sometimes happens, she went off trail. Um, and again, a simple mistake. In the summer, the worst that would have happened is she would have been lost. And while unpleasant in 80, 90-degree weather, if you spend the night in the woods in the Catskills, it's not the end of the world. What happened in this specific case is that she actually ended up falling into a stream, um, by accident, because again, everything was covered with snow, and she was completely drenched. The temperature was about 20 degrees, and she didn't know where she was. Now, she was lucky enough to be able to make her way to a road where somebody gave her a ride, and she was totally fine. But the reason I give this example is not at all to scare you, but just to make sure that you're smart about how you go about winter hiking. So, as always, when you go out, make sure that somebody knows where you're going and leave your coordinates. But also in the winter, really aim to have at least one as a person with you. Arguably, you should actually have at least four people, and that's a really good size group in the winter. And the reason for that is because if something happens, to somebody on the trail, let's say they twist their ankle, one person can stay with them, and make sure that they're warm and safe, while the other two people go and get help so that no one is on trail alone in winter. Also, another thing that's pretty basic but bears repeating is you should always make sure to check the forecast before you go. Keep in mind that the temperature and conditions, and even the type of precipitation at altitude, even at low altitude, like 3,000 feet and above, can be very different from the trailhead. So at the trailhead, you might have the temperature in the 40s, whereas at the summit, it might be 30s or 20s, and with wind chill, it's going to be in the teens. And not only do you want to check the forecast, ideally, you want to talk to people on the ground. So, for example, if you're out in the Adirondacks, you would ideally talk to the rangers and actually find out what are the conditions like, what have people reported that have been on the ground in the past previous days, and what's anticipated. Some places, like for example, is the summit of Mount Washington. When it's open, it's not open in the winter, but when it is open, it they have a radar there, so they can tell you if there's a storm coming in. So checking the weather and making sure to check the weather both at the base and at the summit, is really important. And with that, also just keep in mind that above tree line is going to be very different from below tree line. So when we talk about above tree line, it's just where basically the tree cover ends and you enter usually rocky terrain with some, um, very small plants, maybe the alpine zone, if you're talking about a place like Mount Washington. So there is nothing that's blocking the wind and the snow drifts. So once you get above tree line, the conditions can be drastically different, especially things like wind speed and visibility. And it's very possible that you immediately find yourself in really extreme conditions. That is a marked difference from what you were just experiencing while you were hiking in the forest. If you do proceed to go forward, you really have to make sure that you have somebody in your group that knows the mountain that you're doing really, really well. Because if there are issues with visibility and high winds, you're not really going to be able to navigate by map and compass. Any markers might be obscured. So you really need somebody with the experience, and we're talking like somebody who's done it tens, hundreds of times, who knows how to navigate simply by terrain. And if you don't have somebody like that in your group, it is a good idea to just go ahead and turn around. Um, and if you have a guide with you, like one of our guides, we always say that our job is to really to tell people no. And if you don't have a guide with you, you should make sure that there's somebody in your group, or if it's you, that it's you yourself, who is very clear on being able to say no, on being able to turn the group or yourself around when you might be very, very close to the summit. And the best way to do that, because when you're that close to the summit, um, emotions take over and you start thinking, I spent 3 days off of work to come here, and I spent this much money to do this. I really, really want to make it there. So the best way to kind of avoid that is to set a plan ahead of time. So you would want to go ahead and basically see how many daylight hours you have, divide it approximately in half, because generally you're going to spend as much time hiking out as you are hiking in. Um, that's not always the case, but it's a pretty safe bet. And even if you do spend a little bit less time hiking down, it's good to give yourself that little bit of the buffer, to make your way down the mountain. So you want to divide your day in approximately two halves, and give yourself a buffer at the end. And that's going to be your turnaround time. So basically, let's say it's 12 o'clock. You just have to be very clear in your mind that if it's 12 o'clock, you're not going to hike past that. Even if you're 100 feet from the summit, it doesn't matter. Because you set that time for a reason to begin with. You probably calculated everything, including stops and lunch and everything like that, which is what you should do. And you set that time for a reason when you were under less stress and less pressure and less excitement. So you should always, always stick to that deadline and that firm turnaround time. Um, and just kind of one last tip around that is that if you do have a long day and you do want to spend a little bit of time like hiking in the dark to give yourself a little bit better chance of making it, try to always make sure that time in the dark comes in the morning rather than at night. So aim to finish before sunset always, especially in the winter. Because if you start in the dark in the morning, you know that the sunrise is coming. It's very much like a mental, emotional thing. Um, where you're going to be in much better spirits, where you're going to be less tired. You would have just eaten breakfast, and you know that in an hour the sun is going to rise. Whereas at night you're tired. You don't necessarily know exactly how much time you have left, especially if your pace is slowing down and you feel like you're getting more and more tired. And just in general, knowing that the sun is not going to rise for like another 12 hours can be a very demoralizing thing. So I strongly encourage you to not hike in the dark, especially in the winter, because the temperatures are going to drop um, a lot if it's already cold. For example, the time that I mentioned, on Mount Marcy, when I was hiking in negative 30 degrees, that was that day after sunset. And as soon as that sun went down, the temperatures dropped to negative 30s. So I would try to avoid as much as possible hiking after sunset, especially in the winter. So those are just kind of some general tips, and some of those tips you might know or might have intuitively figured out. So let's get into some more specifics. And the the most important thing, I think, or just practically, is keeping warm and regulating your body temperature during the winter. I think that's also the thing that gives people the most pause about going out in the winter. They're afraid that they're going to be cold. So the goal in the winter, and the number one thing that's going to keep you warm, is to not get wet. As soon as you get wet, it's going to become extremely hard to regulate your body temperature. And how you get wet are basically one of three ways. It might rain, which you you want to have a good hard shell that you have tested, to make sure that it's totally waterproof. You might fall into a creek or something like that, and that comes down to having good waterproof boots and gaiters, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and also just making sure you know where you're going and testing any sort of an ice that you come across. But the main reason you're going to get wet in the winter is sweating. So especially if you're newer to hiking, people tend to think they really need to dress very, very warmly when they hike in the winter, and that is simply not true. You want to have all the extra layers in your pack in case of an emergency or in case of a stop, but you do not want to hike in a lot of layers. In fact, one of our guides has this expression that goes, be bold, start cold. And that's very, very true. You want to start not only feeling cold, you want to be kind of just a little bit on the uncomfortable side of how cold you are. If you're starting feeling like nice and cozy, as soon as you start moving, never mind when you're going to go up that first hill or even a minor incline, you're going to start sweating because your body carrying all that those extra layers and carrying your pack and just going uphill is going to generate all this energy that is going to make you start sweating. And as soon as you sweat, you're wet, and it's going to become really, really hard to regulate your body temperature. So let's say you probably will, especially if you're new to hiking, overdress. So let's say you start in and you thought that you dressed you know, cold enough for you to not be sweating, but you're kind of starting to feel warm. The main thing is just to take care of it as soon as possible. And I think the challenge is that I've seen, especially if you're in a group, is people don't want to stop the group. They don't want to be the one to say like, oh, I need to stop, I need to delayer, and definitely don't do that. Because ultimately it's going to impact your whole day. And if you're with the group and you get into trouble, it's ultimately going to impact the group. So I would strongly, strongly say that, if you're starting to feel like you're too hot, say something and delayer. But even before you start delayering, if you're kind of feeling warm, but it's not too bad, there are small things that you can do. And that's what we call the micro adjustments. So you can do things like remove your gloves. You can roll your sleeves up so that your wrists are exposed. You can take your hat off. You can take your hood off. If you're wearing your buff, you can take your buff off. You can unzip the front of your jacket. If you're wearing a fleece underneath, you can unzip the front of that. And if you have pit zips, leg zips on your pants, you can unzip all of those. Basically, you want to vent everything that you're wearing and allows air in. And then if all of that is not working and you're still feeling warm and you're feeling like you're starting to sweat, you can then start to delayer and basically start taking off layers. And I think that one of the surprising things to people that have not hiked in the winter is just how little you end up wearing. Um, just to give you a couple of examples, I've hiked in 20-degree temperatures in just by my base layer, which is just the single layer that's closest to your body, basically a long sleeve, moisture wicking piece of clothing. Um, and there are much, depending on your exertion, there are much colder temperatures where you might be hiking in just a single layer or just a layer in a vest or just a layer in a shell over that layer. So don't worry about how much you're wearing. Adjust it only based on what your body feels and make sure that you're not sweating. Now, let's say you're hiking along and you're hiking in your one layer and everything's good and you're not sweating. And then let's say you as a guide and they stop the group for a quick water break or somebody needs to go to the bathroom and you'll say to yourself, it's going to be 1 minute and that's totally fine. I'm just going to wait until the person comes back from the bathroom or until the group gets a sip of water. And that's another really major mistake. Playing into kind of that same idea that people get they don't want to pack and unpack things all the time. They don't want to slow down the group if it takes them an extra time to pack and unpack things. You definitely want to avoid that. You want to make sure that you do unpack your pack and take out a layer and put on an extra layer when you stop. Basically, as soon as you stop, put on a layer. And um, that goes even when you're actually feeling warm, because you are going to be feeling warm because you just exerted yourself. You might be on the uphill, you're feeling good. But as soon as you stop, your body is going to start losing that body heat, and it's very hard to get it back once um, once it's gone. So don't be lazy or uncomfortable about it. Just make sure that you take layers off when you're sweating, and as soon as you stop, put at least one layer on to make sure that body heat is not escaping. And I'm definitely happy to go into more details if anybody has questions about specific layers, but I do want to highlight a few things that are helpful. So for your base layer, make sure it's something that's moisture wicking and as fast drying as possible. So your base layer is the layer that's going to be closest to your skin, both on top and bottom, and you want to make sure that it's like a snug fitting layer because you want it to get moisture away from your body. um, and you also want to make sure that if you do sweat, that it dries really really fast. So that's just a really key thing um, that I want to highlight. And then for as far as other really key layers, um, I would really pay attention to your hands. As you probably know, your hands get cold really easily, and your extremities, especially if you're like working uphill and you're carrying your poles, and the blood is already draining from your hands. Um, what I recommend is, first of all, you have to make sure that everything you have in the winter on your hands is waterproof, because just accidentally you are going to touch snow. As you're hiking along, you might grab onto a tree or you might be scrambling up somewhere. So you will touch snow. And some of the most common issues that I see on the trail are people that will bring gloves that are not entirely waterproof. And they will, just through the course of the day, those gloves will get soaked and then they will freeze over the person's hands. And that's not good. They basically have to make sure that they have an extra pair of gloves to change. So waterproof gloves are really important. But if you're going to go into really cold temperatures, or if your hands get cold easily, I would strongly recommend that you invest in a pair of mitts, um, where your fingers are all together. No matter how good your gloves are, in really cold temperatures, or if your hands get cold really easily, they're just not going to keep your hands warm enough. You can hike in a pair of gloves if that's more comfortable, but you should always have a pair of mitts with you to change into. And a layering system that I recommend for that is to have a base layer for your hands, which are just really thin wool gloves, and then a pair of good mitts, good insulated, waterproof mitts on top of those gloves. And the purpose behind it is, well, one, the base layer is going to make your hands a little bit warmer, but also in really cold temperatures, if you have to do something that requires dexterity, like open your pack or even take out your sandwich and eat, you're probably not going to be able to do it in really big mitts or even really big gloves. And that base layer allows you to take your hand out, while not entirely exposing to the cold and still having a layer between you and those elements. And then it's thin enough to fit right back into that mitt. So that's something that I would definitely pay a lot of attention to. But do keep in mind that if your extremities are cold, yes, it can absolutely be bad gloves, or maybe your circulation has always been an issue. But another thing to think about is that your body will naturally take blood away from the extremities to protect the external organs, because that's the number one thing that the body is going to protect, because it's vital for survival. So if your extremities are cold, yes, by all means, you can put in some hand warmers. You can get warmer gloves. You can get warmer hiking boots for your feet. But think about if there is an underlying issue that's causing it. So maybe it's actually your core that's getting cold. And sometimes, even when I haven't had better gloves, just put in an extra layer on, especially if it's a situation where you're not moving, you're not sweating. Let's say you're sitting down for lunch for a few minutes. Put in then those extra layers, or extra couple of layers maybe, um, will warm up your core, and that will allow more blood to circulate and to get into your hands and to keep your hands warm. So definitely pay a lot of attention uh, to your core temperature and how that relates to your extremities. So as I've been alluding to, you definitely do want to dress in layers in the winter and continuously adjust your layers throughout the day. And just to kind of quickly go through what those layers would actually be. And again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to go into details. But you would have your base layers, which are moisture wicking. Then on top, you would have something like a fleece. And then over that, you would have um, an insulating layer, something like a puffy. And then you would have a shell, which is something to keep the wind and the rain out. Depending on your conditions, you might want something really waterproof, or if it's not going to rain and you know that's not really an issue, you might want something more water resistant but more breathable. It's always a trade-off with shells, because you can get something that's really waterproof, but that's also probably going to make you more prone to sweating because it doesn't let the air circulate. Or alternatively, you can get something that's less waterproof, but that maybe is water repellent, but will allow for that air circulation and make it a little bit more comfortable to hike in. And then finally, you want to have something that I call, and I don't think I'm the only one that calls it that, a summit puffy. And that's just a really big puffy. You really want to go by the amount um, of airspace that it creates. So basically, it's thickness. Because if you go online and you look for fills, you'll see that like puffies come in different fills, and that's how much filling it has and what type it is. And for down, it's like it can be 600, it can be 850, it can be 900. And generally, for a summit puffy, we would like something in the 850, 900 range. But again, for different brands that might not really be the same thing. What you really want to look at is how thick it is. So as long as it has an inch of space, or like an inch of thickness, that's something that would be really good in very cold conditions when you're standing still. So let's say you stop for lunch for a few minutes. We generally try to keep stops very short in the winter, but if you do stop, that's something that you might want to consider having with you. And also, it's just a piece of emergency gear, because if something does happen in the woods, again, in the winter, things become a lot more serious. So it's much better that you carry the extra gear in case you do need to use it. And you're not going to be wearing most of it, like we discussed, but it's really good to have in your pack. And then as other emergency items, you can have something like a bivy bag, which is basically a very small, essentially sleeping bag that has some reflective heat panels, essentially. It's something you can wrap somebody around in to keep them warm. Uh, like basically very, very tiny, very thin sleeping bag. But I would say that the number one thing is just make sure that you have all your layers, and make sure that you have extra layers in your pack, even if you are not going to use them the entire day, which is possible, but it's basically just a safety thing. So, with that being said, we've been talking a lot about regulating your body temperature and doing it through not sweating and through putting on extra layers. But the question is, how do you actually generate heat? Because that's what you want. Um, if any of you, have ever had like an older animal in your home, like an older dog, um, sometimes you'll put like a hot water bottle next to them, or the vet will recommend having some sort of like a heating pad, because the issue is they can't, as they get older, they have trouble generating as much heat. uh, Most of us probably don't have trouble generating our own heat, but we do need something to do it. And what we need to generate heat in the winter is calories. A lot of people think that what's going to be good in the winter is to have hot tea, for example. And it's great, it can make you feel really good, but if it's just a thermos of hot tea with nothing in it, it'll make you feel good for a few minutes. It will almost immediately, your body will regulate the temperature to make the temperature of the fluid the same as the rest of your body, and you'll be cold again. Because what you really need is not something warm, which will warm you up, but it won't help your body to generate warmth. You need something to help your body generate warmth, and that's food. So food is really, really important in the winter because that's what's going to keep you warm. Um, Again, just from anecdotal example, we have had a guide who, was out with some friends, and they underestimated the temperature um, that they were hiking in, and she was starting to feel like she was maybe becoming hypothermic. And what she did is she ate as much as she could, and she ended up being able to make it to the end of the hike and to get out of where they were without any serious consequences. And that's a really good strategy. If you're feeling cold, definitely have more calories. But the question becomes then, what types of calories? And I'm going to reference a system that the Adirondack Winter Mountaineering School uses, because I find it to be a really useful kind of analogy to visualize what your calories should come from. So, just like building a fire, there are different types of branches that you would put in the fire to generate the heat. You can think of nutrition very much the same way. So, the first thing that you would put onto the fire to kind of get the fire started is a tinder or the kindling. Maybe paper or birch bark, or you know dry grass if you have it, something that's going to catch fire really fast, but it's also going to burn out really fast. So the equivalent of that in nutrition are basically your sugars and your simple refined carbs. So if you need something that's just going to get your body going, that's going to give it that burst of energy and allow it to generate heat really quickly, but that's also not going to last long, that's anything like white bread, um, sugars like candy or chocolates, or uh, just think like really refined breads mostly, and sugars. So if you want something like that in your, you can certainly bring it in form of food. You can also put things like honey into your tea, so that way you still get like that nice warming effect from the liquid, but you're also getting the calories that are actually going to give your body the ability to keep itself warm. But of course, just kindling is not going to keep a fire going, because it's going to burn out really, really fast. Excuse me. So the next level of building your fire is to put split wood, or those like medium-sized branches that are going to catch fire from the kindling and that are going to burn a little bit longer. Uh, and it might take a little bit longer for them to start going, but they're also going to burn longer. And the equivalent of that in nutrition would be um, um, would be complex carbs and some proteins. So complex carbs, think about just breads, mostly potatoes. People think it's a little bit funny, but I love bringing potatoes in the winter hike. Just those tiny little potatoes. You can bake them in the oven, and they're bite size. You can eat it really quick. Um, multigrain bread, anything like that, and a little bit of protein, whatever you prefer. Um, Peanut butter is always something that's very welcome on the trail. So um, think about, like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich would contain both those simple carbs uh, from maybe the white bread um, and and the jelly, and you can also add some complex carbs in by either just maybe doing one switching up the type of bread, and the peanut butter is in there for the protein and the more complex carbs. So that's kind of that's what you're going to be eating the most on a day hike, and that's what you're most likely going to be having for lunch, um, although you're not really going to be having lunch, but we'll get to that in a second. And then the really long burning part of the fire as a logs, right? So you have this massive log and you're going to put it in the fire, and it might take hours to catch fire. But then when it catches fire, it's going to burn through the night and keep you warm. So the logs are the fats. So the fats can take up to 6 hours to get going in your body to generate energy. But if you're on a longer hike, or especially if you're doing something overnight in the winter, that's what's going to keep you going through the night. Um, so just keep that in mind for overnight and longer trips. Um, so I just said a second ago that you're not really going to be having lunch, and you might be going like, huh? Didn't you just tell me to eat? Yes. The main thing is you want to spread out your eating throughout the day. You really don't want to go more than a half an hour to an hour without eating. And the reason being is because you need energy throughout the day. Your body is already using up a lot more energy just from being out in the cold than it would under normal circumstances. So, for example, a backpacker, um, somebody who normally in their daily life would be consuming about 2,000 calories on a normal day. On an overnight backpacking trip, would need to in the winter would need to consume about 4,000 calories, so double. So you have to be eating all the time to maintain your energy and to keep yourself warm. And one of the things you want to do is to make it really, really easily accessible, everything that you're eating. So rather than having lunch or waiting for lunch, first of all, you don't want to stop too long in the winter, because remember, as soon as you stop, you start losing that body heat. You do want to put the layers on, but if it's cold enough, that's not going to help for long. So you're not going to want to stop for a long lunch. So ideally, you want to have in your pockets or in your hip belt, on your pack, a very useful feature to have in the pack. Make sure to put all of your snacks in there. And even if you're walking, even if the group is not stopping because it's cold, every half an hour to an hour, make sure to eat, even if you're not hungry, just a few bites. Just put a few bites in, eat, and go on your way. Um, that'll just make sure it'll give you endurance, and it'll make sure that you're staying warm. So along with eating, you also want to be drinking, because dehydration is, a pretty serious issue to consider in the winter. Because when you're in a cool, dry air, your fluid increase has to go up. But as we probably know, if you've ever hiked in the winter, we might not feel as thirsty, and also our water might start getting cold, and that's going to make it less palatable. So if it's less palatable, there are a few things you can do. First of all, you should never ever in below freezing temperatures hike with a hydration bladder. One of those, Camelbacks is a common brand, because even with insulating hoses, they will freeze. That hose that goes to your mouth, even if you insulate it, and there are things you can do to insulate it, if it gets into like well below freezing, it will freeze. So you should just not be hiking with those. But if you're hiking with a regular Nalgene, it will freeze too. Not as much, you'll be able to get your water out, but it might be really cold and not palatable. So there are a few things you can do. You can buy an insulating cozy that goes over the top and the bottom, and you can use that. You can fill it up with hot water to begin with, because even the cozy, it's not hermetically sealed, so it will let some cold air in. Your water will probably end up cold by the end of the day. So you can fill up with warmer water or hotter water, so it takes it longer um, to get cold. And then if you don't want to buy like any special equipment or anything like that for the time being, let's say you're just getting into hiking in the winter, you can also put your water bottles inside of wool socks to insulate them. It will have to be entirely inside a nice thick wool, not synthetic, not cotton sock, and that will help insulate it as well. Um, so you can also have a thermos with you. There are trade-offs in that, because it is going to be heavier, but it is also probably going to keep your liquids warmer longer and make it more um, palatable. But whatever you decide to do make sure to drink water. Because serious dehydration can cause between a 20 to 30% drop in anaerobic leg and arm power. So if you're dehydrated, you're really losing a lot of energy, basically. Um, and how you know that you're dehydrated is, if you're on a day hike and you're not going to the bathroom, you're probably dehydrated. Um, it's harder in the winter. Normally we would say go by thirst. In the winter it's a little bit tougher, because sometimes you might not feel thirst as acutely. So if you're normally a type of person that goes to the bathroom multiple times a day and you're not going on the trail, that probably means you're not drinking enough. On a backpacking trip, if you normally get up to go to the bathroom at night and you're not getting up, that chances are you're not drinking enough. um, so yeah, just doing those things, doing making sure that your nutrition and hydration are on point, and that you can access that food, access that water. You're not having it in a hydration bladder, so you're going to want to have like a carabiner to hang it somewhere so you can get it out easily without stopping, so that you don't have to take your pack off. You don't have to wait for a group to stop, so that you're drinking continuously throughout the day. But as long as those are on point, that'll help you feel more comfortable, stay warmer, help your body generate energy, and not get tired as fast. So, as other thing that I kind of want to touch on with eating and drinking is something that you can consider doing in the winter when you hike. Is if you're in a group, you can do what's called a rotating lead. For those of you that may have done um, cycling or have seen cycling, it's similar to that. So basically, you're all in a line, right? And every 50 steps, the first person steps off, and the group passes, and the person joins in the back. And and so you continuously rotate. And there are a few things that there are a few reasons why that's beneficial. So one, just like in cycling, for example, um, the first person is doing the majority of the work. It's not because of drafting like in cycling, but it's because in the winter, at maybe not every time, but a lot of times you might be breaking trail, which means that you will be going on a trail where no one has walked, and there's snow, and it might be even a few inches deep. It might not be that deep, but walking in snow will automatically make it more difficult. So the first person is going to be doing the most work, and then each subsequent person is going to be doing less and less work. So by rotating the group, you're ensuring that people are doing equal amounts of work, essentially, and so that the first person is not exhausted, and the last person is basically just walking on a trail that's completely stomped down, so they're not required to do any work. But the other reason to rotate your group is that when the person rotates, they have a few seconds to eat and drink, just kind of step off the trail while the group passes. It's not a long amount of time, but it is a good reminder and a good like space to break And um, and take a sip of water, take a bite of food. So that's just something that you can try to do on winter hikes. That's a benefit is it also makes sure that the pace stays the same so that one person doesn't just run off and then somebody else is trying to catch up, because basically anyone can go at whatever pace they want, but they stop after a certain amount of steps that you decide. So let's say you decided 50 steps. Even if somebody is really fast, in 50 steps, they stop and they wait for the group to pass and they join in the back. So basically, that ensures that you're seamlessly maintaining the same pace without like asking people to slow down or having to always look back and make sure that no one's in the back, because you will stop after a very short amount of time and let the group pass, see that you're all together, um, and just check on each other. So that's just another technique to try in the winter. And like I mentioned, you know, you will be hiking in some pretty different conditions in the winter as far as snow and ice. So the last section that I want to talk to you about is the type of footwear and traction that you're going to be using on trail. And there we go. So let's talk a little bit about traction footwear, because we talked about mittens and we talked about gloves, which are, you know, which are very important for your hands, for the extremities. What about the other extremities? What about your feet? So first, if you're new to hiking in the winter, what is traction? So the things that you've seen are all examples of traction. Uh, a, a good hiking boot will have traction. You can see on the first picture, those boots have really good traction. And if it's not too icy and it's not too much snow, you can definitely just go in a bare boot, and that's completely fine. And in fact, you do want to make sure that you pick out winter hiking boots with really good traction. Now, the other types of traction that I illustrated here are yak tracks and nano spikes. They are technically traction. I would not recommend taking them to the mountains unless it's a very flat trail, um, just something that you know is not really going to have much slope at all, or is just basically snow where you might even be able to use your bare boots, because really, while they are traction devices, they're more for like icy sidewalks and things like that. You can see that um, they don't really have teeth at the bottom. So yak tracks, nano spikes, I would really leave for like city parks or something really, really flat. So what about the traction in mountains? The three traction devices that you're probably going to be using most often are snowshoes, micro spikes, and crampons. So let's talk about each of those. So snowshoes. If you've never used snowshoes before, you might think that those are the snowshoes that are used on the trail, and they were for a long time. This is what snowshoes looked like. They were really big, and so there are some people that still use them. They work, but they are a little more bulky. So now we use something a little bit lighter and a little bit more compact. So this is what a modern snowshoe looks like. And they come in all sorts of, types of snowshoes. Basically, you can pay a lot for them or not as much. Some of it depends on weight. Some of them have extra features. For example, the ones on the left are pretty basic snowshoes, really good snowshoes, but pretty basic. The ones on the right, you can see that they're binding, which is that red part that goes around your foot, is a lot fancier. It's probably easier to put on, faster to put on. Also in the back, you can see there's a little piece of blue metal um, for the snowshoes on the right. Unfortunately, I can't point to the screen, but it's the picture on the right, and there's like a little piece of metal standing up in the back, and that's a heel lift. And it's not, if you see the snowshoes on the left, they don't have something like that. So that is really, it's going to save you a lot of energy going uphill, because your foot is not going to be up and down. It's basically going to elevate your heel, so it's going to make going uphill easier. So basically, the point of this is that there are different features that snowshoes have, depending on, how much you can pay for them, depending on what's important to you. But you do want to use at least a basic pair of snowshoes if you're post holing. What post holing is your foot is going through the snow and creating a hole. Um, Generally, it depends on snow conditions, but if you have 6 inches of snow or more, you probably will need snowshoes. In certain places like Adirondacks, you will get fined if you don't have snowshoes with you past a certain amount of snow, like 8 inches, for example. And that's because if you post holing, even first of all, it's harder on you because basically your foot is going to fall all the way in. You're going to have to take it all the way back out. It's going to use up a lot of energy. But you know, arguably even more importantly, or as importantly at least, is you're kind of destroying the trail for the people that are going to come behind you, because there are now these giant holes on the trail from your feet. So we want to be courteous to other hikers and also practice, leave no trace principles, and make sure that if there is snow where your feet are falling through, that you using snowshoes to spread out your weight on the trail and not go all the way down through the snow. And as you can also see, snowshoes, besides allowing you to kind of float, if you will, on the snow a little bit more, they also have traction on the bottom of them. You'll see on the one on the left, especially, it's especially clear. There are these metal parts both in the middle and on the sides, and there's a crampons of the snowshoes. So if you are going to start going up steeper terrains, you can use that part of the snowshoe to really dig in and gain traction on steeper parts of the terrain. But really, if you're looking for something to give you traction and you're not dealing with deeper snow, what you want to use is microspikes until it gets either very steep or just the rocks covered with ice. If it's moderately steep and not like really hard ice, you can use microspikes, which are basically snow chains for your tires or for your feet. Snow chains for your feet. Um, and they're very simple to use. All you do is you put them over the bottom of your shoes. You want to make sure that they're taut against the bottom of your foot, um, so that they're not like jiggling around. And all you do is you step, and you step with force. As a number one mistake I think people make when first using microspikes is because they don't trust them, they'll try to step very softly. And then you're just ice skating on them because you're not put enough force to get a grip on the ice, to make indentations in the ice and actually create grip. You're literally just ice skating on top of them. Um, but they're very easy to put on. If you look on the picture on the right, where you see the back of there's like a little tab at the heel, like it sticks up a little bit. That's how you know where the back is. With that tab is to easily take it off. So the tab goes in the back, and they just have to be very tight against your foot. And if they're not, just pull up that rubber part. Um, and then you basically just hike normally, but really plant your feet on the icy sections. Then, if you do come to really steep terrain or like really hard ice, then the microspikes won't go through. Or if it's a rocks covered with ice, like above tree line, that's where you're going to start using crampons. And crampons, as you can see, they basically just they have bigger teeth. They can grab onto things a lot easier. And there are different techniques that you can learn with using crampons. You're probably going to use them less if you're just beginning to hike, but as you get more into, above tree line hikes and steeper hikes, that's really what you're going to use. And not all crampons fit onto hiking boots. Um, and that kind of brings me to my my last recommendation as far as footwear in the winter. So, like I mentioned, not all crampons fit on hiking boots. For some crampons, you need mountaineering boots. And so you just want to be mindful if you are buying crampons, you want to make sure you know what sort of footwear they can function with. But why do people wear mountaineering boots outside of crampons? So basically, here I just wanted to touch on like, and there are so many different types of hiking boots and mountaineering boots, but I just wanted to give three general examples just to give you some idea. So the one you see on the left is basically a hiking boot. And in the winter, the main two things you want for it to have is good traction and it has to be waterproof. It has to be waterproof. Now, some people prefer winterized hiking boots with additional insulation. With a good sock, you probably can go without insulation. So that's kind of a personal decision. But you want a good hiking boot and you want a gaiter to go over it, a leg gaiter. And a leg gaiter is just a piece of gear that goes over your boot from your knee to the start of your boot so that no snow falls in. Because no matter how good your boots are, um, they're not going to do anything good for you if snow gets in there as you're breaking trail. Um, so you want to make sure to have the gate over the top so that nothing falls into the hiking boot. So that's one option. The other option is a mountaineering boot. And that's just a single mountaineering boot. And I'll tell you what the difference is between the single and a double. But a single one, it's just like a regular boot. It's a lot stiffer. It's a lot stiffer, excuse me, than a hiking shoe. It will, take all of the mountaineering crampons. It has special dents in there that a crampon can go into. It's warmer. So for bigger mountains or somewhere where you're going to be using crampons all the time, or somewhere where you really want that warmth when the temperatures are in the negative, a mountaineering boot can be a better fit. Now the downside, of course, is that they are heavier and they're much stiffer than hiking boot. And then finally, you're probably not going to use it a lot locally unless you're backpacking in the winter. That's a double mountaineering boot. And normally you use it for warmth on really tall peaks like 6,000 meters, not feet, plus. But the reason I wanted to put it in here is because if you backpack in the winter, it's actually a very valuable piece of equipment because the problem is, if you just take off your boots, there will be probably sweat in them, unless you like put in special vapor barrier bags on your feet. Your feet will generate some moisture, and because you can't take your boots into the sleeping bag, like even if you leave them in the tent, if you backpacking in the winter, you will see that the tent will get these like white crystals on the inside because it will freeze and below freezing temperatures. So if you leave your boots just in the tent or like outside the tent, they will freeze and you will have to put your feet into frozen boots, which is uncomfortable and difficult, and you'll just have to wear frozen boots for the beginning of the day. So double mountaineering boots, they have an inside boot that is just like a soft, almost like a liner boot, I guess if you want to call it that. And you can take it with you and you can put it with you into the sleeping bag. And that way it's going to stay warm the entire night. And then you'll put the inner boots on your feet and then put them into the outer boots. So that will just prevent your boot from freezing. And those are just the basic types of footwear. Just starting out, I would say you're probably mostly going to be using hiking boots. And you can also rent mountaineering boots for bigger mountains. So you can try them out and see how they work before kind of deciding to make an investment on that. And with that, these are, just some of what I think are the most helpful tips to start out with winter hiking on each of these topics. There's so much more to say. So I welcome any questions or anything you want to know more about.
That was amazing. Thank you. Hopping back in to help with the questions.
Excellent.
So many. I took a lot of notes, so there's going to be some new gear I have to purchase, I think.
That's always
um,
fun.
yeah, it's always fun, but
Yes.
it just
Also can
it's
be
it feels like it
expensive.
never ends. What's that?
It can also be expensive.
Exactly. Yes.
Although, you can always shop, you can always shop like gear that's been reused, and that way you're kind of reusing a piece of gear and also might be a bit of a cheaper way to go.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I like that. And just for everyone who's watching, pop your questions in the chat and I will share them with Jana and she can answer them for you all. So to get started, question is, where do you stuff your gloves, your hat, your buff? They all don't fit into pockets and it's nice to be able to make those quick adjustments without taking your backpack off.
Sure, absolutely. So my big mitts that I usually hook on the outside of my pack just with a carabiner. The only thing, a little tip from a personal experience, make sure to hang them so the tops of the fingers of the middle of the glove are pointing up so that snow doesn't fall into them, and then you have to put in your hands into snow mitts. As far as the buff, the easiest thing to do is to just wrap it around your hand, kind of like a scrunchie or a bracelet or whatever. And the hat, I've seen people just even stuff it into their jacket if there is no room in the pockets. So, like, if your jacket is unzipped but not all the way, um, and it's tight enough about around your body, you can put it in your jacket, or like an inner layer that might be a little bit closer to your body, like a fleece. You can also unzip it and just kind of stuff it in there, and that'll also keep it warm, which is a nice bonus.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there was also a clarification, like in the case that she's only wearing a base layer, let's say, that I guess that's not really
Oh,
a
you're only wearing a
possibility.
base layer. So for that, still applies as the mitts and the buff. The buff goes around your hand. With
Right.
a hat, you could with a hat, I would just, I guess, stuff it in a pocket of your pants
Right.
or your hip belt.
Mm,
That's where some of your snacks are. But generally, having a backpack with like a good hip belt is a great idea. Or
yeah.
even, frankly, something like a fanny pack if you don't have anything else, but something that's just like easily accessible. And
Right.
carabiners are your friend. You definitely are going to want to carry like your water bottles on your carabiners so you can drink easily. But carabiners are your friend, and any sort of gear that you want easily accessible, you can just carabine onto your backpack.
Love that. Perfect. Okay. So we have a couple questions about puffy jackets. So
Yes,
I'm gonna read them all out and then, let you go into that. So
absolutely.
um first question is, what is better for insulation layer, a puffy jacket or a vest? And then the follow-up is, what's better, down or synthetic for the puffy, I'm assuming. And
Good
then the
question.
third one is the Summit Puffy the same as a huge parka that you'd have for winter camp? So the three questions are, what's better for insulation, puffy jacket or vest? What type of puffy do you like? And is a Summit Puffy the same as a winter parka?
Sure. So let me start with answering the question about jackets versus vests. I think they both serve a purpose. What I personally have is I have a vest that's a very thin. Um, I guess it's technically puffy. It's not really puffy looking, but it has some down in it, but it's very thin. And generally, what I use it for is when I'm just too cold to hike in just the base layer.
Mhm.
Um, but I put the vest on top of the base layer, and it has like very small amount of down in the front, not something that's going to make you sweat, because normally you don't want to hike in a puffy unless maybe you're going downhill in very cold temperatures. You don't want to hike in your insulating layer. So it has a very thin layer and it has no down or anything in the back at all. So it's completely breathable, and your back is what's going to sweat the most. So it was a very impulse purchase, but I find it to be a very useful piece of gear.
Yeah.
Um, so I think if it's something that's not going to make you sweat, a vest like that can be good for actually hiking, because it's not going to make your armpits sweat, it's not going to
Mhm.
make your arms sweat, but it will keep your core warm, which is what you're trying to protect, while allowing your hands to be cool and ventilate. So I would kind of use it for those purposes. If you need an insulating layer puffy for like shorter stops or things like that, I would definitely recommend something to sleeves, because when you stop, you definitely want to protect your whole body. As far as down versus synthetic, somewhat of personal preference. The downside to down is it's not going to insulate when wet. So consider that for conditions. It has to be fluffed up, for lack of a better word, to insulate. So if it gets wet, it's going to get crumpled up and not warm. Synthetic, the downside to it, I would say, is just it's harder to find things that are like really big puffies in synthetic. Like I have in for my smaller puffy, for my insulating layer, I have a synthetic one. The other thing to potentially consider is just how they're sourced. As far as what's used to make
Mhm.
your, and that's definitely a personal preference. But if that's something that you're concerned about, it's definitely something to look into. But as far as functionality, I would just say, you know, you can find both. Um, but just make sure that if you're using a synthetic puffy, that it still has like, that it's not really thin, that it still has, if it's your summit puffy, like 1 inch of air or space. And if it's a down puffy, just make sure not to wear it in the rain or take it into some sort of conditions where it's likely to get wet. And then
Yeah.
the last, yeah, and then the last question was about
The
some,
Summit Puffy. The one that goes even on top of Gore-Tex with the assumption that if it's too cold, it's not raining, so
yeah,
that down won't get wet. Or is there a different type of puffy that's lighter than that? So I think
yes. So the
a clarification. Yeah.
between so somebody, I think I remember the question now. Somebody asked if it was like a camp uh coat. Yes, that is basically what we're going for. So you're gonna have two puffies, and I think that's where maybe there's like a little bit of a confusion. So there's gonna be a lighter puffy, which, let's say you hike in Harriman or even the Catskills, you're most likely not going to have a summit puffy unless it's as in like you're not going to put it on unless it's a really cold day. So even if you stop for a few minutes to wait for your group to have a drink or for lunch, you might get away with just having like that smaller insulating layer. The summit puffy is really either true really cold conditions, or
Mhm.
mostly I would carry it as an emergency piece of gear, even in the Catskills. So yes, that's like the really big puffy. That's the one where you want that like inch of space that's gonna go over everything. And on a nice day in a Catskills, you might never use it. But the whole idea is that if something happens, you want to be able to survive a night in the forest. Just anytime you go out hiking. So that's almost, think of it as like a top part of a sleeping bag almost, where you'll be able to wrap yourself with somebody else in it and really, really keep them warm. It's for that as an emergency piece of gear, or if you're going somewhere where it is going to be -30, because there,
Right.
if you stop even for 5 minutes, you want to have something like really big and thick to make sure you don't lose that body heat.
Yeah. Great. All right. I know we're a little bit over time, but how about one more question?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm
Okay.
happy to stay for as many questions as
All right.
people have, and people are always welcome to email me too with any questions.
Okay. Great. So, what are your thoughts on using hand warmers in
Sure.
addition to the mitten?
In addition to what?
The base layer and the mitten.
Gotcha. So I always carry hand warmers. I have never used them. I carry them mostly for clients. People like to use them. I don't have anything against them. Um, I just find that if you have a really good pair of mitts, I generally don't need them. So like my pair of mitts will warm up my hands without using hand warmers. Um, is the only other thing I would say is just again kind of be mindful of what your cold hands are telling you, because basically when you're putting on a hand warmer, they'll warm up your hands and that's great, but also just be mindful of where is that coming from. Like, is your core too cold? Are your gloves not sufficient for the temperatures? They're great to have, they should be in your pack as an emergency item, but just be mindful of what you're kind of using to substitute them for. And as far as foot warmers, again, I've seen people use them. Um, for foot warmers specifically because they're hard to put on, as in like if you're in the snow and the cold, I would try to be very mindful that you have good enough boots and socks and whatever system you're using, that you don't need to put in foot warmers unless again it's an emergency, because taking your feet out in like, you know, 10 feet visibility and 40-mile-an-hour winds is really not feasible.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you have a recommendation for a summit puffy?
Sure. I mean, I use a Patagonia Summit coffee just because I was able to get it secondhand. But honestly, the brand does not matter. Um, it's the thickness. It's really the thickness. Don't worry about the
Yeah.
brand. Make sure it's thick.
Awesome. Cool. Well, let's wrap it up. I just wanted to say thank you again. And maybe the best way to finish this is for you to share with everyone where they can follow up with you and find you, follow you, all of that good stuff.
Yes, absolutely. So you can email me at Jana, that's Jana, at adventureuntamed.com. So that's my email address. It'll go to me directly. And, you know, we're Adventure Untamed. You can follow us on Instagram at adventure_untamed, or on Facebook, just search Adventure Untamed. And if you Google us, we'll come up as the first result. And always feel free to reach out by whatever means is easiest. And I'm always happy to talk gear in winter.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks to everyone who's asking questions. I loved all of those. We have another event tomorrow night if you're interested in backcountry skiing and lots of stuff for the next month or so. So definitely check out Mappy Hour. Hopefully you're already getting emails. But yeah, for winter stuff, we still have another month and a half of fun winter before we get
Yeah.
into spring. Yeah. All right. And with that, good night, everyone.